In the depths of a Finnish winter, when darkness swallowed the land for 20 hours a day and temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, one man became death itself. Armed with nothing but an iron-sighted rifle and unbreakable will, he would earn a nickname that would echo through history, striking terror into the hearts of an entire invading army. They called him the White Death. This is the story of Simo Häyhä, a quiet farmer who became the most lethal sniper in human history. In just 100 days of warfare, he would eliminate over 500 enemy soldiers, turning the frozen forests of Finland into a graveyard for the Soviet Union. What makes his legend even more extraordinary is that he accomplished this impossible feat using tactics and equipment that most modern snipers would consider primitive. No scope, no spotter, no high-tech gear, just a man, his rifle, and the killing cold of the Finnish wilderness. The year was 1939, and the world was already plunging into the chaos of global war. But in the remote forests along Finland's eastern border, an even more brutal conflict was about to begin. When Stalin's massive war machine rolled across the frontier, it seemed like the end for the tiny Nordic nation. The numbers were staggering and hopeless. 600,000 Soviet troops backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft faced off against a Finnish army less than half their size, equipped with barely any armor and a handful of outdated planes. But Stalin had made one critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the fighting spirit of the Finnish people and the deadly effectiveness of one particular farm boy from the village of Rautjärvi. Simo Häyhä was born on December 17, 1905, in the Keskinen hamlet, a remote farming community in southern Finland near the Russian border. He was the seventh of 8 children in a devoutly Lutheran farming family. His father Juho owned the Mattila farm, while his mother Katriina was known throughout the village as a loving and tireless worker. Life in this corner of Finland was harsh but simple. The endless forests stretched in every direction, broken only by frozen lakes and small clearings where families like the Häyhäs carved out their existence from the unforgiving land. From his earliest years, Simo was different from his siblings. While other children played games or helped with lighter farm work, he was drawn to the deep woods that surrounded their home. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning with game that fed the family and stories of tracking animals through terrain that would challenge even experienced hunters. His father recognized something special in the quiet boy and began teaching him to shoot when he was barely tall enough to hold a rifle properly. By the time Simo reached his teenage years, his reputation as a marksman was already spreading throughout the Viipuri province. He could hit targets that seemed impossible to other shooters, threading bullets through gaps in the forest that most men couldn't even see clearly. But what set him apart wasn't just his accuracy. It was his patience, his ability to become one with the wilderness around him, invisible and deadly. After completing his basic education in the village of Mietilä, Simo returned to work the family farm alongside his eldest brother. But farming was just one part of his life. His true passion lay in the competitions held by the Civil Guard, Finland's voluntary militia organization. These weren't casual shooting contests. They were serious military exercises designed to prepare Finnish civilians for the war that many believed was inevitable. Simo dominated these competitions with an almost supernatural consistency. His home began to fill with trophies for marksmanship, awards that recognized not just his skill, but his dedication to perfecting his craft. He could hit a small target 6 times in a row from 150 meters within a single minute, a feat that left seasoned military instructors shaking their heads in amazement. But perhaps more telling than his shooting ability was his character. In group photographs from these competitions, Simo invariably stood at the back, uncomfortable with attention, preferring to let his rifle do the talking. He was a man of few words, someone who found more meaning in the silent language of the forest than in the chatter of village life. This quiet intensity would soon serve him well in ways he could never have imagined. The storm clouds of war had been gathering across Europe throughout the 1930s, and Finland found itself caught between 2 expanding empires. To the west lay Nazi Germany, already swallowing up neighboring countries with terrifying efficiency. To the east loomed the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, a paranoid dictator who viewed Finland's independence as a threat to his security. Stalin's demands were simple and impossible to accept. He wanted Finland to cede territory along the border, lease naval bases to the Soviet Union, and essentially surrender its sovereignty. When the Finnish government refused, Stalin made his choice. On November 30th, 1939, without a declaration of war, Soviet forces launched a massive invasion across multiple fronts. The world watched in shock as over 500,000 Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed into Finland like a steel tsunami. International observers expected the tiny nation to collapse within days, maybe weeks at most. The Soviet Union had 150 million citizens. Finland had less than 4 million. The math seemed brutally simple, but mathematics don't account for the human spirit, and they certainly don't account for men like Simo Häyhä. When the invasion began, Simo was called up with thousands of other Civil Guard members to reinforce the regular Finnish army. He was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, under the command of Lieutenant Arne Juutilainen. Their destination was a place that would soon become legendary in Finnish military history, the Kollaa river front. The Kollaa was not an impressive waterway. In summer it was barely more than a creek, winding through dense forests and marshy ground. But in the brutal winter of 1939, it became something else entirely. The ground was frozen so hard that digging trenches was nearly impossible. The river itself was a ribbon of ice cutting through a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. This was where the Soviet Union chose to launch one of its major offensives, sending wave after wave of troops across the frozen terrain toward the Finnish defensive positions. They expected to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers, to push through and continue their advance toward the heart of Finland. Instead, they walked into a killing field unlike anything the world had ever seen. The winter of 1939-40 was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, with wind Karelian Isthmus, where muchils that could kill exposed flesh in minutes. The fighting took place, recorded a temperature of -43 degrees on January 16th, 1940. Snow lay 2 meters deep in places, creating a landscape where movement was nearly impossible for anyone not intimately familiar with the terrain. For the Soviet forces, many of whom came from warmer regions of the vast empire, these conditions were a nightmare. Their equipment failed in the cold, their vehicles broke down or became hopelessly stuck. Soldiers suffered from frostbite so severe that entire units became combat ineffective before they ever encountered the enemy. But for Simo Häyhä, this frozen hell was home. He understood this landscape in ways that no military manual could teach. Every ridge, every grove of pine trees, every depression in the snow-covered ground was as familiar to him as the rooms of his family farmhouse. While Soviet soldiers stumbled through drifts that came up to their waists, Simo moved like a ghost, using paths and shortcuts that existed only in his memory and the memories of men who had hunted these forests for generations. The Battle of Kollaa would last for the entire duration of the Winter War, and it was here that Simo Häyhä would forge his legend. The Finnish defensive line stretched along the frozen waterway, manned by soldiers who knew they were vastly outnumbered, but refused to yield a single meter of their homeland. Soviet artillery pounded their positions with a fury that defied comprehension. On some days, nearly 40,000 shells crashed down on the Finnish defenders, turning the forest into a hellscape of splintered trees and smoking craters. Against this overwhelming firepower, the Finns could respond with barely 1,000 rounds per day. Every shot had to count, every bullet had to find its mark, because there were no reserves, no reinforcements coming over the hill to save them. There was only the thin line of Finnish soldiers standing between the Red Army and the conquest of their nation. It was in this desperate situation that Simo Häyhä revealed his true nature. While other soldiers huddled in their frozen trenches, enduring the constant bombardment and waiting for the next infantry assault, Simo took a different approach. He became the hunter that he had always been, except now his prey walked on 2 legs and carried weapons designed to kill him. His equipment was almost laughably simple by modern standards. He carried a Finnish-made M28-30 rifle, an improved version of the Russian Mosin Nagant that had been modified for Arctic conditions. The stock was made from Arctic birch, preventing it from warping in the extreme cold that rendered other weapons useless. The bolt action was smooth and reliable, the sights were zeroed to perfection, and most importantly, Simo knew this rifle like an extension of his own body. What made his weapon choice even more remarkable was what he chose not to use. While many snipers relied on telescopic sights to extend their range and accuracy, Simo deliberately used only iron sights. This decision seemed insane to military observers, but it revealed the depth of his tactical understanding. A telescopic sight forced a sniper to raise his head higher, creating a larger target for enemy marksmen. The glass lenses could fog up or freeze in the brutal cold, rendering them useless at critical moments. Most dangerously, sunlight reflecting off the scope could give away a sniper's position like a beacon, turning the hunter into the hunted. Simo had learned to shoot with iron sights during his years of hunting and civil guard competitions. He could judge distances, windage, and trajectory with an accuracy that seemed supernatural. His effective range might have been shorter than a scoped rifle, but within that range, he was absolutely lethal. His camouflage was equally ingenious in its simplicity. While Soviet troops wore dark uniforms that stood out starkly against the snow, Simo dressed entirely in white. He fashioned a snowsuit that made him nearly invisible against the winter landscape, blending so perfectly with his surroundings that he could remain motionless for hours while enemy patrols passed within meters of his position. But even this wasn't enough for the perfectionist farmer turned sniper. Simo developed techniques that pushed concealment to almost mythical levels. He would pack snow into his mouth before taking position, preventing his breath from forming visible clouds in the frigid air that might give away his location. He constructed snow barriers and shooting positions that looked like natural drifts, creating hides that were virtually undetectable, even from close range. His hunting technique was patience incarnate. While other soldiers fought in the chaos of direct combat, Simo would select his position before dawn, sometimes spending the entire day motionless, waiting for the perfect shot. He studied the patterns of Soviet patrols, learned their routines, identified their leaders and their most dangerous soldiers. When he finally squeezed the trigger, it was with the cold precision of a man who understood that every bullet was precious and every miss was a failure. The psychological impact of his presence began to spread through the Soviet ranks like a plague of fear. Soldiers would advance through the forest, knowing that death might be watching them from any shadow, any snowdrift, any cluster of trees. The invisible sniper became a specter that haunted their dreams and made every patrol a journey through a landscape of potential death. Soviet commanders tried everything to eliminate this phantom killer. They sent counter-sniper teams equipped with the best optical equipment the Red Army could provide. They called in artillery strikes on suspected sniper positions, turning entire sections of forest into moonscapes of destruction. They even brought in specialized units trained specifically for hunting snipers, men who understood the deadly game that Simo was playing better than most. All of their efforts failed. Simo seemed to anticipate their moves, disappearing before the artillery arrived, relocating before the counter-snipers could triangulate his position. He was fighting a war of perfect information against an enemy that could never quite pin down where the next shot would come from. The kills began to mount with mechanical precision. 5 in a day, then 10, then 15. Each confirmed elimination was recorded, according to strict Finnish military protocols. Only verified deaths counted toward his tally, and only kills made with his rifle as a sniper were included in the official record. The additional enemy soldiers he eliminated with his submachine gun during his role as squad leader were counted separately, bringing his total elimination count to staggering heights. As winter deepened and the war dragged on, Simo Häyhä became something more than a soldier. He became a symbol of Finnish resistance, proof that determination and skill could triumph over overwhelming odds. Stories of the White Death spread not just through the Finnish forces, but across international borders. War correspondents began writing about the mysterious sniper who was single-handedly decimating Soviet units. But the legend came with a price. The more famous Simo became, the more desperate the Soviets became to eliminate him. The pressure was mounting from the highest levels of the Soviet military command. Stalin himself had reportedly been briefed on the mysterious Finnish sniper, who was turning his grand invasion into a humiliating bloodbath. Orders came down through the chain of command with unprecedented urgency: find the White Death, kill the White Death. End this nightmare before it destroys the morale of entire divisions. The bounty placed on Simo's head grew to astronomical proportions for a single soldier. Counter-sniper specialists from across the Soviet Union were rushed to the Kollaa front. Elite marksmen, who had earned their reputations in conflicts from Spain to Mongolia. These weren't ordinary soldiers fumbling through the forest. These were professionals, men who understood the deadly chess game that Simo was playing and had the skills to match him shot for shot. But Simo had advantages that went beyond mere marksmanship. This was his homeland, terrain he had traversed since childhood. Every tree, every ridge, every frozen stream held memories and knowledge that no amount of military training could replicate. While his Soviet counterparts studied maps and relied on reconnaissance reports, Simo moved through the landscape like a predator returning to familiar hunting grounds. His daily routine became a ritual of calculated lethality. Before dawn, while the forest was still shrouded in the deepest darkness, he would slip from the Finnish positions like a wraith. His white camouflage made him invisible against the snow-covered terrain, and his intimate knowledge of the ground allowed him to move without leaving the telltale tracks that might give away his presence to enemy scouts. He would select his firing position with the methodical care of an artist choosing the perfect angle for a masterpiece. Every detail mattered. The background had to provide complete concealment from multiple angles. The field of fire had to offer clear shots at the most likely enemy approach routes. The escape routes had to be planned and memorized, multiple paths that would allow him to vanish before Soviet forces could respond to his attack. Once in position, Simo would begin the waiting game that separated true snipers from mere marksmen. Hours would pass in absolute stillness, his body so motionless that snow would accumulate on his shoulders and rifle barrel, further enhancing his camouflage. His breathing would slow to an almost meditative rhythm, each exhalation carefully controlled to prevent the formation of vapor clouds that might betray his location. Through his iron sights, he would study the Soviet positions with the patience of a scholar examining ancient texts. He learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished officers from enlisted men, the body language that revealed fear or confidence, the patterns of movement that indicated when soldiers were most vulnerable. Soviet troops began to move differently in areas where the White Death was known to operate, their normal military bearing replaced by the nervous, darting movements of prey animals sensing a predator. The kills came with mechanical precision, each shot placed with surgical accuracy. A Soviet officer organizing an assault would suddenly crumple, his subordinates diving for cover as the crack of Simo's rifle echoed through the forest. Machine gun crews would find their operators eliminated one by one, forcing the survivors to abandon their positions or risk joining their comrades in death. Artillery spotters calling in coordinates for bombardments would fall silent mid-transmission, their radios crackling with unanswered calls from confused battery commanders. But Simo's impact extended far beyond the raw mathematics of his kill count. The psychological warfare he waged was perhaps even more devastating than his marksmanship. Soviet soldiers began to refuse patrol assignments in sectors where the White Death was active. Units reported mysterious illnesses that coincidentally spiked whenever they were ordered to advance through areas under his watch. The mere possibility of his presence could freeze entire companies in place, turning aggressive offensives into defensive huddles behind whatever cover they could find. Soviet commanders found themselves facing a new type of warfare, one their military doctrine had never prepared them to handle. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot seem to kill? Traditional tactics became useless against a single man who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before retaliation was possible. The winter itself became Simo's greatest ally. As temperatures dropped to levels that challenged human survival, the differences between the Finnish defenders and their Soviet attackers became even more pronounced. Simo moved through conditions that left enemy soldiers struggling just to stay alive, while Red Army troops suffered from frostbite, equipment failures, and the constant exhaustion of fighting in an alien environment. The White Death seemed to draw strength from the cold that was slowly destroying his enemies. His rifle, that simple Finnish-made bolt-action weapon, became an extension of his will. He knew every quirk of its mechanism, every subtle variation in its accuracy under different conditions. The Arctic birch stock remained stable when other weapons warped and cracked. The improved sights stayed true when lesser optics failed. Most importantly, the weapon's reliability meant that when Simo squeezed the trigger, death followed with absolute certainty. The ammunition he carried was precious beyond measure. In the desperate supply situation faced by the Finnish forces, every cartridge had to justify its existence. There were no second chances, no opportunity for ranging shots or casual target practice. When Simo chambered a round and settled his cheek against the rifle stock, it was with the knowledge that this bullet would either kill an enemy soldier or represent a failure that his nation could not afford. His technique evolved throughout the winter, adapting to the changing tactics of his increasingly desperate enemies. When Soviet forces began moving only at night, Simo learned to use sound and movement to track targets he could barely see. When they started using smoke screens to obscure their advances, he positioned himself to catch them as they emerged from the artificial fog. When counter-sniper teams began hunting him with systematic grid searches, he developed new methods of concealment and movement that stayed one step ahead of their increasingly sophisticated efforts. The physical demands of his campaign were staggering. Spending hours motionless in temperatures that could kill exposed flesh in minutes required a level of physical conditioning that went beyond normal human endurance. Simo's body adapted to conditions that would have hospitalized ordinary men. His hands remained steady despite the cold that made other soldiers' fingers too numb to pull triggers. His eyes stayed sharp when lesser men found their vision blurred by tears that froze before they could fall. But perhaps most remarkably, his mind remained clear and focused throughout the grinding months of warfare. While other soldiers succumbed to combat fatigue, shell shock, and the psychological breakdown that came with prolonged exposure to mortal danger, Simo maintained the cold mental discipline that separated professional killers from mere survivors. Each day brought new challenges, new tactical puzzles to solve, new ways that his enemies might try to trap or eliminate him. The Finnish forces around him began to regard their quiet sniper with something approaching reverence. In a war where every small victory was celebrated and every hero was treasured, Simo Häyhä represented something beyond normal human achievement. He was proof that a single, determined individual could change the course of battles, that skill and will could triumph over overwhelming numerical superiority. Stories of his exploits spread through the Finnish lines like wildfire. Soldiers would compete to tell tales of his latest impossible shot, his newest escape from certain death, his continued survival against odds that defied rational explanation. The White Death became more than a man. He became a legend that sustained Finnish morale during the darkest hours of their desperate struggle. As February turned toward March and the winter war entered its final phase, Simo's kill count continued its relentless climb toward numbers that seemed impossible for a single human being to achieve. Each confirmed elimination brought him closer to a record that might never be equaled, a testament to the deadly perfection that could be achieved when exceptional skill met desperate necessity. But legends, no matter how carefully crafted, are still built around mortal men. And mortal men, no matter how skilled or careful, can only cheat death for so long before it finally claims its due. The morning of March 6, 1940, dawned clear and cold along the Kollaa riverfront. Somewhere in the frozen wilderness, a Soviet soldier was adjusting his aim, preparing to fire a shot that would end the career of the most feared sniper in military history. The shot came without warning, as death so often does in war. Simo had been in his position since before dawn, watching a Soviet patrol moving through the trees below his ridge. Through his iron sights, he tracked their movements with the same methodical patience that had made him the most feared sniper on Earth. The temperature was brutal even by Finnish standards, hovering near -40 degrees, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. He had already selected his target, a Soviet sergeant directing his men through the snow-covered terrain. The range was perfect. Well within the killing distance he had mastered through countless hours of practice and 500 confirmed eliminations. Simo controlled his breathing, felt his heartbeat slow to that familiar rhythm that preceded each lethal shot, and began his trigger squeeze. But somewhere in the maze of trees and shadows, another rifle was trained on him. The explosive bullet struck Simo in the lower left jaw with devastating force. The impact was so violent that it seemed to lift him from his firing position spinning him away from the rifle that had been his constant companion throughout the winter campaign. Blood sprayed across the pristine snow as consciousness fled from his shattered body. Against all odds, Simo Häyhä survived. After 11 days in a coma and 26 surgeries to rebuild his shattered face, the White Death awakened as the peace treaty was signed. In just 100 days, a quiet farmer had achieved what entire armies could not, proving that in the frozen crucible of war, determination and skill could overcome impossible numbers. His legacy endures as the deadliest sniper in history, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to yield.